Hello and welcome to the first ever video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. On this channel I will be discussing lots of things around the NHL, including rumors, injuries, signings, some stats, as well as how each team is doing when this hockey season gets underway. But for today, we're going to start off by discussing some recent signings, some injury news, a player who was named captain for his team, and some trade rumors. And that is coming up right now. So hello and welcome to the first ever video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. I would first like to start off with some of the signings that have happened in the last few days. So to start with, the Chicago Blackhawks have finished up their RFA business for the offseason, as they have signed their last two RFAs in Philipp Kurashev and Caleb Jones. Now, Philipp Kurashev gets a 1-year, one-way deal that has an AAV of $750,000. Now, he is a decent bottom six forward, I would say. Had a career year last year, putting up 6 goals and 23 points in 67 games. Now, he is a decent bottom six forward, I would say, and with the Hawks entering their new rebuild phase right now and having a lot of younger players, I could definitely see him getting an opportunity to play on the Hawks' third line this year. But he's more of a bottom six forward, so I'd say for the next year, he could probably get a chance at the third line, maybe play on the fourth line, but he's more of a fourth line forward. But this is just for this year. I really do think he could get a chance at the third line. Next, we have Caleb Jones. He signs a 1-year, one-way deal as well, but he has an AAV of $1.35 million. Now, Jones is a much better player than Kurashev is, and he's a defenseman too. He should definitely get a chance to build off his career year from last year, where he had 15 points in 61 games played. I definitely think that he is a very good third-pair defenseman for this Hawks team. It's only a 1-year deal, but he should get an expanded role with all the moves the Hawks have made in this offseason. So I definitely think that this is good signings for both Kurashev and Jones, and they're definitely worth the money. I definitely do believe that both of them will get expanded roles with this Hawks rebuild, and they should continue to build off their career years from last year. Now, the Philadelphia Flyers have signed young forward Jackson Cates to a 1-year, two-way deal that has an AAV of $775,000. Now, Cates is a pretty good young defenseman. He hasn't really got much NHL experience, played 11 games last year at the NHL level and got a goal. He's been a pretty decent AHL piece this year, but with guys like Joel Farabee and Bobby Brink both going to be injured to start the season, I think he does have a chance of making the roster. Definitely has a chance of probably being a fourth-line forward, but I could definitely see him make the roster for Philadelphia this year, and I could see him try and establish himself more as an NHL forward at this point in his career. Now, the Golden Knights have also signed some players, signing 2 of them. First, Jake Leschyshyn, who gets a 3-year, one-way contract with an AAV of $767,000. Now, Leschyshyn played his first NHL season last year. He was up and down, split time between the NHL and the AHL. He had a decent season, though, putting up 6 points in 41 games last year. Because the Golden Knights had a lot of injuries last year, they had to rely on a lot of their AHL depth, and Leschyshyn was a big part of that. And with some other guys possibly being injured to start this year too, and with all their off-season moves, I do think Leschyshyn has a good chance of making the fourth line for this team this year, to start at least. And given the fact that it was a one-way deal, he's going to have to go through waivers to be sent to the AHL, so I definitely see a possibility where he stays in the NHL this year and grows as a fourth-line center. And then they gave a 3-year contract extension to young forward Paul Cotter, who gets a 3-year, two-way deal with an AAV of $775,000. Now, Cotter also got his first NHL experience last year, putting up 2 goals in 7 games. Still more of an AHL forward this year, and it really wouldn't surprise me if he goes back to the AHL to play this year. But with Vegas' lack of forward depth, I could also see him making a run at trying to be like a fourth line, maybe a spare forward for the Golden Knights this year, and I think it's definitely a real possibility. But this contract will actually get started at the beginning of next year because there's an extension. So that's all the signings we have for you here today. Next, I want to get on to some of the injury updates. Now, these are some really bad injuries that have happened over the last 2-3 weeks. First, I want to touch on Robin Lehner. Knights announced this week will be out for the entire season due to hip surgery. Now, Lehner did miss some time, especially later in the season last year, due to injuries, and he did have end the year with multiple injuries. So it did sound like he was going to start the season injured. I would have said probably the first 2-3 months. He probably would have been back around December, January. That's what my prediction. But now he's going to be injured for the entirety of the season, and he's definitely Vegas's starting goaltender. So, given the fact that he put .907 save percentage and 2.83 goals against average last year in 44 games, they're going to miss that production desperately. Now, they do have some goalies who could replace him. Of course, you have young Logan Thompson, who really came into his own last year, but I would see him more of as a backup or 1B instead of a starter. I could see him as a tandem goalie maybe, but he's not a starter yet at this point in his career. And then they have Laurent Brossoit, who is also more of a backup goalie, but he could also be injured to start the season. So Vegas could go and acquire a goalie. That's something we'll get into at another time. But Vegas' goaltending position sure is shaky after this news. And they also got news that Nolan Patrick, who's a decent enough bottom six forward, former second overall pick in 2017, has had lots of injury problems over his career, including last year where he only played 25 games for Vegas and put up 7 points. It sounds like he might miss the entirety of this season due to injuries. We don't know exactly what the injury is right now, but Patrick has had a long history back to his time in Philadelphia, and he's just not really been able to stay healthy to this point. So, I mean, there is a small chance he comes back in maybe March or April next year, but it's starting to sound more and more likely that he probably will not be playing at all this year, which is definitely going to give Vegas some depleted depth up front for this year. And they're going to have to call more upon guys like those guys who we just talked about, Lecision and Cotter, who got those new deals. So, some bad injury news for Vegas as the injury bug continues to bite at them, given the fact that they probably missed the playoffs last year due to the amount of man games lost last year. Now, former Vegas Golden Knight, who was dealt this offseason, Max Pacioretty, is also going to miss significant time due to injury. Now, he has a torn Achilles and will have to get surgery that will keep him out 6 months. So, Vegas traded him in a deal I really didn't like this offseason when they gave Pacioretty and good young defenseman Dylan Coughlin to Carolina for future considerations. I still don't know why Vegas would give a good goal-scoring player like Pacioretty away to Carolina for literally nothing. I really think they could have gotten something for him, but it does justify this deal a little bit more that Pacioretty's a bit injured. I don't think he was injured when he was going to Carolina, but now the Hurricanes are only going to have about 3 months of Pacioretty instead of a full season. He is entering the final year of his deal and is to be a free agent next year, so that's just really bad news. He was supposed to be that good goal-scoring player that helps Carolina improve their goal scoring, but now they're just going to have to try and find someone probably in the system to try and fill that role. Next, we have Washington Capitals center Nicholas Backstrom, who in the offseason said that he was going to have hip surgery and he was probably going to be out for the first few months of the season. He probably wasn't going to be back until the new year, but recent reports say that the Washington Capitals seem to be getting prepared for the season, like Backstrom might not play at all this year. That's some really bad news for the Capitals because Backstrom is a huge part to this top six. After putting up 31 points in 47 games last year, he was also a little bit injured last year, but this is definitely bad news because Backstrom is definitely the Caps' second-line center, and although they did get Dylan Strome, who's a decent replacement to fill his role, I don't think you can really replace Nick Backstrom. So if he really is out for the entirety of the year, it's going to be a huge blow to the Washington Capitals. And lastly, I want to talk about Nikolai Kinzov. Now, the defenseman for the San Jose Sharks missed the entire season last year due to injury, and after he got a little bit more healthy this year, and the Sharks made a little bit of roster moves, I think he had a shot at making the NHL roster. But now there's reports that he's going to have core muscle surgery and be out for 6 months as well. So this is a big blow to Kinzov's career because he did have a good season 2 years ago in the shortened season when he put up 10 points in 56 games and looked like he could be a decent third pair defenseman for the Sharks blue line. but he probably won't be back now until February or March. And after missing so much time, I'm really wondering what that will do to his career. So that's all the injury news. Next, we have some important good news, and that is that Jacob Trouba has been named the captain of the New York Rangers. Now, I would not have guessed Trouba to probably be the captain. I was one of the people that thought that either Chris Kreider or Mika Zibanejad, one of those leaders in the offense, would have definitely gotten the captain. But I can see why they named Trouba captain. Trouba is definitely a leader in that locker room. I think they could have made some worse decisions to be named captain. I do not think Trouba is by far the worst choice for captain. I do think they could have given it to Kreider or Zibanejad. But even in the lineup, Trouba is partners on the defensive pair with Keandre Miller, and Miller really likes playing with him. And Trouba is definitely a leader to a lot of the younger guys in that Rangers locker room. So I don't think by any means this was the wrong decision. And I think Trouba will definitely be a good captain, and especially given the fact that he's still signed for the next 4 seasons at $8 million. And he is a big-bodied physical defenseman who will not shy away from dropping a big hit or two in a game. But I definitely like this move by the Rangers to name Trouba captain. I fully expect that Zibanejad and Kreider will wear the A's on their jersey and be assistant captains for the upcoming season, as I do think those three are probably the biggest leaders in that locker room. And lastly here, I want to touch on some trade rumors. So to start off, we're going to talk about the Vancouver Canucks. Now, the Canucks have had a very productive offseason this year, getting guys like Ilya Mikheyev in free agency and signing top European forward Andrei Kuzmenko from Russia. In bringing in those two, the Canucks probably promised them top 6 roles, as Mikheyev put up some decent point totals in Toronto and was definitely a middle 6 forward, but I think he can definitely be a second-line winger in Vancouver. And Kuzmenko is coming in from Europe, and there were a lot of teams interested in him, and one of the sticking points of his negotiations was that he wanted a top 6 role in an NHL team. So given the fact that the Canucks were a team to sign him, they probably did promise him a top 6 role. So if you add Mikheyev and Kuzmenko to this Canucks top 6, as it sits right now, you're probably going to have guys like JT Miller, Brock Besser, Elias Pettersson, and Bo Horvat all in that top 6. So with the additions, the Canucks would have bottom 6 wingers would be guys like Garland, Höglander, Podkolzin, and Pearson. And honestly, those guys are more third, second line players instead of fourth line players. So I definitely see them moving at least 1, if not 2 forwards before the start of next year. Now, who could they move? There have been lots of talks over the last year and a half. There's been talks about Brock Besser. Those rumors were pretty much doused after Besser signed his new 3-year deal this offseason. And then there were a lot of speculations about JT Miller, Connor Garland, Nils Höglander, Tanner Pearson, Jason Dickinson. There were a ton of forward rumors. But at this point in the offseason, where we're getting close to training camp and they're going to have to start finalizing their roster, I think one or two of these 3 forwards will probably be moved, and that is Connor Garland, JT Miller, or Tanner Pearson. Now, Pearson is probably the least likely to be moved because he is more of a third-line winger, and his $3.25 million cap hit is not justify what he brings to the table offensively. I know he did have a decent year last year where he had 14 goals and 34 points in 68 games, but we've seen a lot of teams this year not be willing to help other teams out cap-wise. So if there's a player who's not really living up to his contract, which I think is what Pearson's case is, then they ask for a lot in return. We saw this situation with the Flyers and Jackets, where the Flyers could not offload James Van Riemsdyk's contract due to the fact that everyone who they were talking to wanted either a first-round pick or top prospect from them, and the Jackets had to give away good top 6 forward Oliver Bjorkstrand because they were in a cap bind, and they gave him to Seattle for only a 3rd and 4th round pick. So taking on lots of money on contracts if the play isn't justified has been really hard this year. So given the fact they have to move Pearson along with a sweetener to get rid of that contract, I don't think they would do that. I think it's probably a last resort where if they can't find any other trade options, maybe they do end up moving Pearson. but I definitely think he's the lowest of the three to be moved. Next, I would say, is Connor Garland. Garland has definitely produced well, especially last year where he had 52 points in 77 games, but he was one of the best 5-on-5 players in the league. He's been signed 4 years at $4.95 million, so he's signed long-term at a cost-controlled deal, and I do think there would definitely be interest in Connor Garland. He's definitely a decent middle six forward, and I could see the Canucks maybe holding on to him, but I do think the Canucks could trade him for a decent package. I could see 2 assets probably going back to Vancouver for Garland, but I don't think he's the most likely to be moved. I definitely think the most likely would be JT Miller. Now, Miller had a monster season last year, putting up 32 goals and 99 points in 80 games, and he was one of the top 10 in points last year. But he is entering the final year of his deal, and contract talks really aren't going anywhere right now between the Canucks and Miller. And although there does seem to still be hope that a deal can get done between them, there also seems to be likely at this point that Miller might be moved by the Canucks. Now, I think they could probably get maybe a first or second round pick, as well as a decent young defenseman, and maybe one more asset if they were to move Miller. And I definitely think that, given the fact he's only got 1 year left, that the team acquiring really wouldn't be attached to Miller for too long. And if they did want to work out an extension before the trade, then maybe Vancouver can get even better package because they're giving him up as well as an extension. But definitely expect one of these 3 players, in my opinion, to be moved around training camp, or at the very least probably before the start of the season. And lastly, I want to touch on the New Jersey Devils. Now, Devils' weakness going into this season was goaltending, and goaltending was definitely a problem for them over the past few years. A couple of years ago, just before the COVID-shortened season, they signed Corey Crawford in free agency to back up Mackenzie Blackwood, but a couple weeks before training camp, he retired, which really left Jersey without a good backup goalie. Last year, they brought in Jonathan Bernier to back up Mackenzie Blackwood, and they did okay during the first few months of the season, but then Blackwood got hurt, then Bernier was a starter, and then Bernier got hurt, and for the most part it was youngsters like Nico Dawes and Akariye Schmid who were the goalies, while Blackwood and Bernier dealt with injuries. Now, they have really improved their goaltending this year by acquiring Vitek Vanacek from Washington at the draft. He is definitely an upgrade on both of their goalies that they had going into the season last year. And I think that it'll probably be a tandem this year of Vanacek and Blackwood, and I could see Vanacek being the starter by the end of the year. But something that I really haven't seen much on is Jonathan Bernier. Now, Bernier was a decent backup last year, played in 10 games last year, and had a .902 save percentage. And in my opinion, he's one of the more decent backups in the league. Now, he's entering the final year of his deal, and he's got a $4.1 million cap hit. But I do think there are a few options for Bernier. Now, one, given the fact that the Devils have had goaltending injuries galore over the last couple of seasons, I would say that maybe they're going to run with 3 goaltenders and keep an extra one on the roster just in case a goalie gets injured, because Vanacek does have a bit of injury history, and Blackwood absolutely does. So maybe they keep Bernier as like a 3rd string goalie and rotate him in, and maybe if a guy like Vanacek or Blackwood comes in, now they have a really good 3rd string goalie who can transition into the backup role. Maybe that's a possibility. And I know Bernier could still be injured, so he might miss the first few weeks of the season. But I think the more likely thing would be that Bernier probably gets traded before the start of the season. Now, I think they should roll with Vanacek and Blackwood, but I think that Nico Dawes definitely showed last year that he could be a good 3rd string goalie and maybe a future NHL goalie. But I think that Dawes has showed enough to be a 3rd string goalie and come up if there is an injury. Even Schmid, to some degree, did have good success in the NHL. Now, the Devils are close to the cap, and they could use some extra cap flexibility, and I think moving Bernier could help them. He only has 1 year left. He's got $4.1 million cap hit, so he shouldn't be too hard to trade. And for a team like maybe Vegas or Arizona or even Washington to some extent, who could use a backup goalie, I think they should all be calling Jersey and asking about the availability of Bernier, because I do think he is one of the better backups of the league. I'd like to know what you think. Does Bernier get traded? Does he remain with the Devils? Does he maybe go through waivers before the start of the season? I'd like to hear what you think. But that's definitely a situation that I think everyone should keep an eye on while we get closer to training camp. So that's all for today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. Also leave a comment so we can discuss the things that were talked about here today. On top of that, I also do a blog, which I will link in the description below. And remember to stay tuned for new videos every week. I will see you guys later.